I've been threatening to do this for a little while, so I just got the impulse to start doing this again. I realized I re-listened to a couple of past videos that I did, some of them almost a year ago, and realized that I had made the promise to continue this process. And, well, you know how 2020 was. It just got away from me. So I'm going to start this series on Christianity. And this is not only for those of you for whom I've done these histories before, but it's also, again, for individuals who might be interested in doing the research necessary to do universal worship. And Christianity is, of course, a very complex topic. It's very big. When I started thinking about it, I got completely overwhelmed. So I'm just calling this a history that's condensed enough to preserve sanity while being complete enough to not inspire derision. And it's going to have to come in several parts, and I'm going to try to make these parts not terribly long, each part. And just to kind of give you a sense of it, I actually went and did an outline, and these are all the things that I'm going to have to talk about. And there's 12 of them, kind of like the apostles. And I'm going to try to make each one of these relatively short. I'd like to keep each one down to 15 or 20 minutes if I can. We'll see. We'll see how that works. But as you can see, there's a big, huge, long history here. And I'm not even going to go through it here because you can look at the screen if you want to. But in this particular video, we're going to look at the first one, which is just texts. Because when it comes to Christianity, the texts are probably one of the most controversial things about Christianity. I am constantly seeing all these memes online about the history of Christianity and its texts, namely the group of texts that we call the Bible. And what I wanted to do in this very first video is just talk briefly about what we mean by texts, the history, a little bit of the history of those texts, although we'll get into more of that with some of these other topics. And just to kind of clear the air about some of that, because honestly, there's a lot of crap out there. Even among skeptics, a lot of skeptics are actually just simply wrong about some of the things that they assert about Christianity or about the text specifically. So that's what I wanted to do in this first video. So the first thing to talk about with regard to biblical texts, and to remind everybody, the word Bible means library. It comes from the Greek biblos. And when we're talking about a Bible, we're already talking about a collection of texts, which is weird because we think of the Bible as like a text, right? But it is not a text. It is a collection of texts that has been gathered together in one cover. And so, and of course, Christianity, classic Christianity, insists that this grouping of texts that we call the Bible, the library, that this assemblage of texts is a definitive assembly that tells a specific kind of history, even if you are theologically interpreting it in different ways. And so we tend to think of it as one thing, but it is not one thing. And it and each one of the texts within it has a specific history. Now, we don't know all of this history, but we do know more about the history of some of the books than a lot of people think, especially about the first part of the Bible, which is referred to by Christians as the Old Testament. The Old Testament, some of those texts are very ancient, as scriptural texts go, and Jews have a robust history and recollection of the history of these texts, which a lot of Christians just blithely ignore. Kind of like, the entire Old Testament just, fell out of Moses's butt somehow on Sinai. And that's just not what happened. And when I do these videos on Judaism, I'll talk about all of that. But when it comes to biblical texts, And by that I mean Christian biblical texts. What is interesting about the history of the biblical texts is that the Bible as we know it now, the Christian Bible, I should say, the Western Christian Bible, Protestant Christian Bible that we know now, began its history during a time when the technology for writing itself was changing somewhat. And so this is part of the history of what became the Bible and how these set of texts came to be edited together and put together to begin with. And so we have to talk a little bit about that. In fact, the story of Christianity and the Roman Empire is part of this history, part of how the physical reality of a book, such as we know it today, actually came into being. On the left, this is a picture of Egyptians collecting papyrus reeds to make into papyrus. And the way in which papyrus paper was made and still is made is that you take these reeds that are kind of gelatinous in a way, and you lay a bunch of them down, and then you lay another layer of them on top, perpendicular, and then you lay another layer on top of that. So you've got like at least 3 layers, and then you just pound the crap out of them. And through a process of washing and pounding, it takes quite a while. What basically happens is that the gelatinous mucilaginous, however the word is, components of the stalks begin to sort of collapse, if you will, the plant cover of the stalks, and they begin to adhere together. And as you flatten it down more and more and more, eventually, and you kind of roll it, there's all this processing that's done. Eventually you will get a sheet that you can use as a writing instrument. And papyrus was used, it's been used for thousands of years at this point. It's still used, actually, for certain things. So it's still being produced. It's just obviously, kind of a novelty item now. So when the biblical texts, the texts that we refer to as the biblical texts, started to be written, most of them originally were written on papyrus, products of one kind or another. There are different qualities of papyrus, obviously, that are made. And because of the nature of papyrus, it is possible to, if you want to reuse part of it, you can like scrape off the ink on the top of it and rewrite on top of it. So there are actually biblical texts that have been written on top of, or copies that have been written on top of other things. So that's the reality in which the first texts were written. As Bibles were later assembled, if they were finer copies that were made, and you have to remember, there's no Xerox machines here, there's no printing press, so everything that's being written is being written by hand, by people who know how to write. They are called scribes. And scribes are very, if they're good, they're very sought after, skilled people, because they're able to take these large pieces of papyrus, or as we'll see in a minute, these large lengths of parchment, and they're able to map this stuff out, and they're able to write very precisely, because it has to be done within certain margins. You don't want to waste any space, so there's usually very little punctuation, if any. It's done very concisely. And then they're rolled up, obviously. Now, what parchment is another writing technology or printing technology that was used for many, many years, but it was much more expensive. And the better of the manuscripts, of biblical manuscripts, were written on parchment. What parchment is skin, goat skin, sheepskin, cow skin, that has been usually of a young animal, so it's a little bit thinner, so that it's been treated in a certain way so that it's very, very thin, almost and translucent. You can actually see light through it. It's very, very thin. And if it's done correctly, it will take a nice fine, it's a nice fine writing surface. A nice parchment is white. It's very white. And so, for example, when Constantine, Emperor Constantine, commissioned the first Bibles in the mid-4th century, these Bibles were supposed to be official texts. And so they were printed on parchment by scribes who knew how to do this well. All right. Now, how does this, and of course, parchments and papyrus were written in leaves, and oftentimes with the leaves, in kind of rectangular pieces. And then the rectangular pieces were glued together with special types of, adhesives to create a roll. And in fact, Torah scrolls among the Jews are still done this way today. They are still written on parchment. They're not written on paper. They're written on parchment that is still produced specifically for this purpose. And you glue these sheets together, and they're done into these scrolls. A scroll is a big, huge roll, or smaller rolls that can just be sort of rolled up and stuck in your pocket. All right. So almost all of the, well, really all of the ancient manuscripts, like the way the Gospels were originally written or whatever, would be written on these like little rolls. Now, how books came about is that it's a lot easier to just take the leaves. Somebody had the idea of just taking the leaves, and instead of rolling them out, just stacking them together and actually kind of attaching them along one side. And that's how the book was developed. And eventually people started writing on both sides of the parchment or on the papyrus, but originally they didn't do that. And then you'd put these leaves together and, stitch them up on one side to keep them, and then put them in some covers, and you're good to go. The most important thing is that you can hide them. And this is what appears to be the case, at least in Christian communities that started to use what we now see of as the classic book model. They started to, they created books so that they could carry their books around and hide them. They're easier, and they don't get squished. It doesn't damage the print. Because the problem with both papyrus and parchment is that if they're crinkled too much, or there's too much uneven pressure, the ink can actually peel off after a little while. So it actually, having it in leaves that are unattached by adhesive actually preserves stuff a little bit better. And we know that this was done in many instances, because if you look at, for example, the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts, the famous Nag Hammadi texts that were found in Egypt, they're all done in loose leaf book style. That's how they were found. In fact, they were found in the tomb of a monk who had been buried with this collection of Gnostic texts in this loose leaf fashion on his chest. So that's literally how they were buried with him and how they were found. So we know that by the 3rd century, Christians in particular were doing this. There's also evidence that other groups that were other religious groups that were marginalized, such as the Manichaeans, were doing this as well. So we don't know who exactly invented it, but it was Christian communities that picked it up, and that evolved eventually into the books we know today. So the Bible was as a collection of texts, was created during this time period when the technology of printed material was changing itself. So I talk a little bit about this. Basically, by the 4th century, books started to become the main way in which things would be carried around. And a book was referred to as a codex. And so many books are codices. Now, by the 8th century in Europe, as I say here, anything that was not transferred to a codex was commonly lost. And this was actually a quick and dirty way to censor things, so that if you came upon a collection of texts and you decided that, these texts weren't worth copying, you just didn't copy them into the book. And so, eventually the roll or scroll would be lost. There you go, which is not, incidentally, what happened with most of the so-called Christian texts that were rejected. I'll talk about in a minute. Now, and this is also the time period when the Library of Alexandria went through some travails, and so I wanted to clear up some information about this. So the Library of Alexandria famously lost prestige during this same time period. It was a library that was known for its fabulous collection of all kinds of antiquities in scroll and roll form. And so oftentimes Christians are just simply blamed for the sack or the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. But in fact, by the Christian era, the Library of Alexandria was already in decline. It had been sacked and burned several times, both accidentally and on purpose. And the first time it was burned was by Julius Caesar in 48 BCE. This is during the time period when he was coming into power. And apparently it was accidental, the burning of it. There was a civil conflict going on at the time in the city of Alexandria that he was trying to quell. He was moving his troops in support of Cleopatra at the time, and just because of the fighting, a fire broke out, not only in the Library of Alexandria itself, but in apparently a storage annex. And it was probably one of the more tragic of the fires. It's estimated that over 40,000 scrolls were burned. And the library never quite recovered from that. There were a couple of other instances, however, of deliberate destruction. One was in 391. This is after Emperor Constantine. Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of some parts of the library that were still in use. It had declined a great deal by that time in his efforts to stamp out Roman paganism. And then in 640 CE, Caliph Umar, who was also responsible for the destruction of all variants. No, that was Uthman. We'll talk about Uthman later. I always get Uthman and Umar confused. Caliph Umar just ordered the destruction of any manuscripts that could be found in the city of Alexandria that might contradict the Quran when his army took possession of the city. But the library had ceased to exist as such by that time. So what his soldiers did instead was they just went around and rounded up all the scrolls they could find, anybody that had anything, anything at all, and they used it to run the baths for like a month or something. Now, the infamous and brutal murder of Hypatia, who was an archivist, a philosopher, and the daughter of the last director of the library, a man named Theon, that occurred at the hands of a fanatical Christian mob in 415 CE, and that was 5 years after Rome was first sacked. So the death of Hypatia was actually a separate thing. It wasn't the Library of Alexandria was already in significant decline by that time. It had not been destroyed yet, but had gradually been falling into ruin. And then after Caliph Umar's sack of the city, basically the buildings were abandoned. When we're talking about the Bible, the Christian Bible, or any of the Bibles, we also have to talk about languages. That's the other part of it. And of course, there are a number of different languages that are associated with the Bible and the books of the Bible, Christian Bible. And of course, there's first the Hebrew Bible, or as the Jews call it, the Tanakh. And so Hebrew obviously is an important language to be used. And the Hebrew Bible was canonized in the late 1st century, not long after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. I say CD there, it's actually CE. And the reason it was canonized was because Christians were using parts of it. So the Jewish community at the time, especially since the temple had been sacked, realized that they needed to just sort of close this collection. so that they could distinguish it from whatever stuff the Christians were doing, claiming it or whatever. So you have the Hebrew Bible, which when I do videos about the Jews and Judaism, I'll talk about that. And then, of course, we have Aramaic. And Aramaic was the lingua franca, or the main language of the common people throughout the Middle East, which included at the time Syria, Palestine, Western Parthia, which was the western part of what we now call Iran. It was also the language that Jesus spoke and the main language of what will become the basis for the Jewish Talmuds, both the Jewish Talmuds, the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmud. I noticed that there's also a typo right here. In fact, it's freaking me out so much, I'm going to stop this and fix that. Hold on. See how easy that was? I fixed both of those things. And then, of course, there's Greek. So Aramaic is the lingua franca of the common people. Greek is the lingua franca of the educated class throughout the Middle East, quote unquote Middle East, and into the Near East, and then throughout the Mediterranean and Roman worlds. A translation of the Jewish texts from Hebrew into Greek was called the Septuagint, and that translation occurred between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. And that was the first Old Testament. That was actually the Old Testament that the early Christians knew was the Septuagint. This was a translation that was sponsored by Jewish elders at a certain point after Alexander the Great went through and conquered much of, the Mediterranean and what we call the Middle East. Now, all original New Testament texts were written in Koine Greek, which was a common kind of slang Greek, kind of like American English to British English to King's English. Koine Greek was sort of like that. It was sort of like American English, And it was the idiomatic Greek of the day. Now, from Greek, many of these texts of the Bible, that became the New Testament, were translated into Coptic, Aramaic, and a few other languages. So a lot of people talk about like the Peshitta Syriac text, which is an Aramaic text, especially an Aramaic New Testament. That's not the original language that those texts were in. Those texts were in Greek and then translated into Aramaic because Aramaic was the language of a lot of people of the Near East, you see. So they were written in Greek first and then translated into Aramaic. Then there was Roman Latin, of course, and Roman Latin was the lingua franca for commerce and government throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The first fully Latin translation of the Bible as a selection of texts is attributed to St. Jerome in the late 4th century CE, although it is known that several others actually worked on the translation as well. And this early translation is the basis for what is called the Vulgate Bible that is still used by the Roman Catholic or Western Christian Church. So you see here you have a layering of different languages. You have Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic and Roman Latin. Now, Hebrew, by this time, Jews did not speak Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. Hebrew was a liturgical language. It was used for chanting the Torah or for ritual purposes. It was not used in everyday discourse. Aramaic was used in everyday discourse. And in fact, in the Koine Greek of the New Testament and a couple of the Gospels, are preserved some of Jesus's Aramaic words, and they are thought to probably have been things he really said because he would have spoken Aramaic. So most people, say in Palestine or Judea or Syria, they probably knew 3 languages, some Latin, some Greek, some Aramaic. And if they were an educated Jew like Paul of the Pauline epistles, then he knew Hebrew as well, more than likely. So most people were multilingual. It was actually a fairly sophisticated set of circumstances. Now, the Eastern Orthodox Church, since I mentioned the Western Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches use in their liturgy and in their Bibles, they use either Koine Greek or Greek Slavonic texts. Although in the last few centuries, vernacular translations have also been permitted. So you'll notice that the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman Latin churches use different translations of these texts for themselves. And if you want to get kind of a sense of a history of some of this and some of the importance of this, here are a couple of books, or a couple of authors actually, that you can avail yourself of. One is the guy named Bart Ehrman. I include this book up here because, I mean, he's written tons of books, and he's very controversial to evangelical Christians because he's a critical theorist. He doesn't believe that there was actually a Jesus, but he does a really, really good job of looking at the history of the texts themselves, which is, that's historical critical method at its finest. It's what I was taught in graduate school, and it's an important component of what it means to understand the history of Christianity. And then the First Messiah is an interesting text that I mentioned here that I will also refer to when I talk about later on in this series of videos. And it actually looks at, it's a treatment and an interpretation of some very important texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a Dead Sea Scroll scholar, an expert. And he's looking at that community, the Qumran community, which of course predated Christianity, but was instrumental in developing a lot of the ideas of the Messiah that later on will find their way into Christianity. So this is his book about the Aramaic and Hebrew scriptures that are found in the Qumran caves that have become associated with the Dead Sea Scroll community. And then, of course, there's the whole politics of why you have so many Bibles, or why you have, so many arguments over texts. So these are just a few things that I'm going to say. Why so many Bibles? First of all, the idea of a Bible or a collection of texts is not unique to Christianity. In fact, all the evidence internal, even within the text itself and in the process by which the texts were picked, indicate that the idea of a collection of texts into one canon, the word canon, C-A-N-O-N, canon, means rule. So, we talk about like the Star Trek canon, in other words, the Star Trek episodes that are considered to be part of the Star Trek narrative. Well, these are the books that came to be considered the books that were part of the official Christian narrative, right? The canon, as it were. The idea of a canon came from Jewish and Manichaean sources. And I know I have threatened in other places to do a Manichaean video or two, and I will still do that. But this is one of the areas in which the Manichaeans and a couple of other groups, actually the Montanists as well, which is a group, another religious group that was very popular at one time in early Christianity. They were sort of like an early version of Pentecostalists. I mean, seriously, they were. But they had their own collection of texts and revealed texts. And so between what they were doing and what the Jews were doing and what the Manichaeans were doing, eventually there develops this idea of a canon. And this is what inspires down the road Christian authorities like the Emperor Constantine to say, well, if we're going to have an official Christian church that's going to run the Roman Empire, we need a book to do it, So that's where these ideas came from. The first text collections of Christian texts began in the late 2nd century, and they were collections of Gospels, the four that we've become familiar with, along with a number of other Gospels. The first person to mention the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was a guy named Irenaeus in the late 2nd century. And he was the one who made the first argument for there being only four Gospels, which indicates that there's a whole bunch more running around. And his argument was just as there are four winds, northeast, south, and west, so there are four Gospels. That was his argument. But there were also collections of Pauline letters, letters that were attributed to Paul. There were also other collections of texts. There were historical texts. There were story texts, or what are called the Acts. We have the Acts of the Apostles, but there were a bunch of other Acts. There were all kinds of collections that circulated separately. We know, for example, that St. Augustine, the first St. Augustine, because there are two of them. The first St. Augustine, who was the North African dude, and wrote the Confessions and the City of God, and all the important things. He was converted as a result of him having an experience with a collection of Paul's epistles. That he talks about this in his Confessions, that he had a collection of Pauline epistles, letters, that he, it was obviously a copy, that he was reading, and he read some passage that Paul said, and then he had this religious experience, and that's when he converted. So as I've mentioned, Emperor Constantine commissioned the development of a Bible around the same time as the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Council of Nicaea was a council that Constantine convened in order to determine what the Orthodox official creed of Christianity would be, because there were lots of different types of Christianity that were running around at the time. And so they were trying to determine what was going to be heretical and what was not. And so representatives, bishops from all these different sects of Christianity came to this council, and they hammered it out. The group declared some people heretics and wrote the Nicene Creed as sort of, the framework for what Orthodox Christian belief would be. And even then, the Eastern Church and the Western Church ended up not agreeing. There were two factions who later on down the line disagreed about a slight bit of punctuation that occurred in one of the manuscripts, because they had scribes writing all this stuff down. And I can't even remember now exactly what the item of punctuation was, but depending on what it is in the Greek, it slightly changes the meaning of what the Trinity means, what it implies about how the Trinity is configured. And the Eastern Orthodox Church took one interpretation, and the Roman Catholics took another. And even though they both used the Nicene Creed, they used different interpretations of it. So down the line here in one of these videos, I'll explain what that means. So that was part of what happened at the Council of Nicaea. Now, if you were an Arian Christian or an Nestorian Christian, did that automatically mean, or Pelagian Christian, did that automatically mean that you quit being that and became Orthodox? Hell no. What happened is that a lot of those people who were declared heretics went off and they did their own thing anyway. Because they weren't just representing theologies, they were representing communities. And communities don't just, give up and die just because, some council somewhere says, well, you're a heretic now. So, this gave rise to lots of different types of Christianities in different places. The Nestorian Christians are really interesting. They just said, fine, you don't like us, screw you. And they followed the Manichaeans out east and ended up in China. So where there were, by the Tang Dynasty, there were large Nestorian Christian communities. So, or they went to India. That was another place they went. So Constantine commissioned a Bible not long after that. It's like, okay, we've got a creed, now we need a Bible. But it was going to take a lot longer to do a Bible than just, have a committee and decide what the Trinity means. It would take a while and much discussion. And in fact, there are a number of historical texts that have survived that are in easy grasp of your view if you have the internet, and where a lot of these discussions are recorded. And one of these is, I list these two guys, Eusebius and Epiphanius/Papias. The reason I say /Papias is because Epiphanius is actually quoting some stuff from a much older source, Papias. Papias actually we don't know who he was, but he was a name that was connected to a source that preserved stories about how the Gospel of Mark was written, which are actually really interesting. And they appear to be authentic, essentially, from what we can tell. And they go back to the first century. So that obviously is an important piece of information. So the debates basically hinged on antiquity, how close to the source are these texts? Can that be determined? They hinge on usefulness. How many different groups of people are using these texts? In other words, part of the reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were used is because everyone agreed, even at the time, that the Gospel of Mark was the oldest text, because according to Papias, it was the oldest of the Gospels. So even they knew that even then, and so everybody wanted that one. And the other three, Matthew, Luke, and John, they're narratives, and one of the narrators, Luke, who also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, that was like a two-part book, actually, the Gospel of Luke and then the Acts of the Apostles. And this was an individual who was known to have been associated with Paul. So, in other words, there's some kind of legacy legitimacy there, in terms of transmission. A lot of it also hinged on what books had proved to be the most popular. And this was based on their dispersion in the larger Christian community. How many of the communities had a copy of the Gospel of Mark? How many of them had a copy of, all of these specific Pauline epistles? You know what I mean? So it wasn't a matter of, oh, this text has reincarnation in it and we're going to chop it out. It wasn't like that. In fact, hardly any of these texts, of the ones that have survived that were not included in the canon, most of them are actually pretty Christian in one way or another. They may have some different miracle stories or kind of odd things, but they're not that weird. What you have to remember is, so this is what I say here. Texts, even texts that were rejected or were determined not to be canonical, were still retained. Most of them were still retained, or many of them were, for purposes of study and contemplation. And you can see there are lots of different collections of them, but some of them you can see in the Apocrypha, which still exists in the Catholic Bible, obviously, between the First and the Old and New Testaments. And then there's another collection that are called the Apostolic Fathers. And the Apostolic Fathers retained quite a reputation for a long time because and remained copied and useful because it had a lot of useful historical information in it about early Christian communities, a lot of stories, the books like the Didache and the Epistle to Barnabas and the letters of Saint Clement. These were all respected Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century, some in the 1st century. And the Didache, for example, is clearly connected to the community that wrote the Gospel of Matthew. So these texts were kept, but they just weren't considered to be canonical in the sense that they weren't considered to be as useful for pastoral purposes, for community purposes. So it's not correct to say that these books were removed from the Bible, because there was no Bible at the time, you see, for them to be removed from. It was just determined for a variety of reasons, and some of them were theological, but honestly, when you look at the arguments that Eusebius and Epiphanius give, it's mostly utility. It's mostly popularity. It has very little to do with theology. So it was decided they were not suitable to be canon, although many of the texts remained canon in some Eastern Christian churches. So that, for example, in some Eastern Christian churches, in the Bibles, you'll see the book, First and Second Clement, or you'll see Third Corinthians, or you'll see the Epistle to Barnabas. Barnabas was an associate of Paul, and in addition, both in the Western and Eastern churches, many of the non-canonical books continued to be extensively mined for homilies over the coming centuries deep into the medieval period. So if you read like sermons that were, especially in the West, that were set sermons, you would do this. They would do the same sermons year after year, basically. You can see the stories that they're using to write these sermons were often drawn from these apocryphal non-canonical texts, because the people they were giving sermons to couldn't read anyway, so it really didn't matter, Texts that were evinced theologies that were determined to be heretical, such as the Gnostic texts, obviously, or the Arian texts, they were rejected. And this is Arian, not Arian, not Arian like Nazi, but Arian as Arianism, which was a kind of Christianity that was rejected as heretical. And then during, of course, the Protestant period, the apocryphal books were removed from the common Bibles, and that were being translated then into vernacular languages. So when the Latin Vulgate started to be translated during the Protestant period from Latin to German to Swiss to English, those apocryphal texts were removed, and the translations that were done of the Latin texts were done with reference to the manuscript tradition and to Hebrew texts, and so they were cleaned up. So that actually the early German and Swiss and English translations are actually better in some ways than the Vulgate was by the time it came down to them. And these are a couple of illustrations. We have here on the left a depiction of the Council of Nicaea. From the later Middle Ages. I think this is from like 1590 or something. And so obviously they're wearing the wrong hats, for one thing. They didn't have those hats came later. But, that happened in oh, look, I screwed that one right up myself here. Hold on. I'm going to stop this again. See, this is what happens when you throw something together quickly over your lunch break. That was another typo. Council of Nicaea 323, not 3. It was actually 323 to 325. It started in 323 and ended in 325. Sometimes when you look it up, like in Wikipedia, it'll say 325. It's like, no, that's when it ended. It actually started 2 years before. That's how long it took. But anyway, so Council of Nicaea, very important. But then this is also a map here, which we'll talk more about later on in these series, of what is called the Great Schism, which I've already sort of alluded to by mentioning the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. The Great Schism happened in 1054. It was about a generation before generation and a half, maybe, before the First Crusade was called. And it was the commutual excommunication of the Western and Eastern churches from each other. And so this is just a map which kind of shows the division here, and they had been sort of encroaching on each other for a little while, but this obviously had profound implications for the Bible later on, and for the development of certain types of theology. So the reason I show you this is because of the next slide, which is kind of where we'll end up. The history of the Bible and politics in the West is also the history of Christianity. So you don't really get those separately. At no time in its history is the Christian religion or the texts that express and perform it ever separated from the political realities of the day. So Christianity from the get-go is fundamentally political in its implications. And these politics obviously shape its theologies, its variant theologies, and the local, regional, and national flavors that Christianity takes on. This is why it is so incredibly diverse and difficult to talk about easily. There is also substantive evidence that if Constantine had not accepted Christianity as the organizing principle of his empire, that the religion may not have survived in a recognizable form. And that is because at the time of Constantine's conversion, only about 10 to 15% of the Roman population was Christian. And while that is a lot of people given the population of Rome, of the Roman Empire, and a rather extraordinary growth from very humble beginnings, it still is a major minority of people. You know what I mean? So the Christianizing of the empire itself, even by law, took several centuries. It was not something that just happened overnight. So it was a real concerted effort on the part of Roman authorities once Christianity became the official Roman religion, which actually happened after Constantine. Well, he did make it first he signed the law of tolerance, tolerating it, and then he did make it the official religion, but he didn't like enforce it as intensely as people who came after him did. So Christianity has proven itself to be remarkably adaptable and protean, particularly since its earliest texts by themselves, as we will see, are rather thin on theological details, ethical prescriptions, and advice regarding social organization. And that's part of the reason why even the non-canonical texts were kept for a while. And it's even part of the reason why eventually the Hebrew texts, the Old Testament, so to speak, in a particular version with some of the order of the books rearranged, were included as the part of the Christian Bible, because the fact is that if you just take the New Testament as it is, honestly, there's not a lot there, in terms of trying to figure out an entire ethical system and having a cosmology and a theology and figuring out how to organize an ecclesiastical structure, a church, how you would do that. And there's really not a lot there. But if you add the Hebrew Bible to it, the Old Testament to it, and then interpret the Old Testament sort of through the lens of the New Testament, which is what Christians do, then you can sort of draw certain things out of the Hebrew Bible, and find those things to be useful, which is exactly what the Catholic Church did, actually. And it's exactly what people like St. Augustine and other folks like that did. So Christianity has proven itself to be very adaptable. It's a syncretic faith in many ways. So this is just this last slide is just a visual sources in order of appearance, because if this goes on YouTube now, we're supposed to do all of our sources. They actually do a source check on everything now. So from here, this turned out to be far longer than I thought it would be, but from here we will begin to look at some of the actual interesting history of all of this.